This is Judge Joe Brown, and you're watching We All Be News TV, the
News-free Dixie.
news-free Dixie for the 21st century.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. This has been,
Yeah.
this has been a long journey. Perhaps before going into some of the final details, which are outlined in the Pocket Hill King, which is the third and final book, and for me, the end of the story. Before going into that in some detail, it might be useful to give you a bit of the history. I only knew Martin King the last year of his life. I was the garrulist in Vietnam and spent most of my time there out in the country observing the massacre of civilians, mostly children. When I returned after an injury, I wrote a piece for Ramparts magazine. Some of the older folks amongst you may remember Ramparts. It was a progressive magazine produced in San Francisco with Warren Hinkle and Bob Scheer, who is still active and working on it. The piece was published in January of 1967 and was called The Children of Vietnam. It was followed by the creation of a committee of responsibility, which I co-founded with Bernie Lown, from Physicians in Social Responsibility in Boston and Harvard. And we brought 100 children, 100 war-injured children from Vietnam to America and placed them in hospitals across the country. I had one triple amputee, Quam, at a school that I founded. After they killed Martin and I turned away from political activity, I founded a series of experimental summer Hilliard type of schools. And we brought Quan into the one that was up in Oshman, New York. Martin King was on his way to Jamaica at the Atlanta airport when he went through his mail, and Bernard Lee, his bodyguard, I went up to get some food. Martin came upon the Ramparts magazine, because he was a subscriber to Ramparts. And as he thumbed through it, he saw the ghastly photographs that I had taken and that were in that magazine. He became visibly moved, according to Bernard. And when Bernard brought the food back, thank you. When Bernard brought the food back, he pushed it away and said, "You know, I'll never enjoy a meal again until we end this war." He then reached out to me, and I opened my files to him, and he openly wept. He asked me to go with him from Providence, Rhode Island, where he delivered a sermon one day, to Boston, where together we would open Vietnam Summer up at Harvard. And he openly wept when he saw the balance of the files that I had retained. So he then anticipated what could be done and what could he do. He was to deliver the famous Riverside speech, which most of you recall, on the 4th of April, 1967. And it was agreed that we would attempt to mount an independent political campaign against the Johnson administration. And the ticket would be a King Spock ticket. Dr. Benjamin Spock would run for vice president. So we were about the business of planning that. He asked me to head the National Conference of New Politics, which was to be the movement organization that was to develop this third-party ticket against Lyndon Johnson. before 250,000 people after one march at the United Nations on April 15th, 1967, I proposed for the first time to that crowd that we had that ticket and we engage in that form of independent electoral politics. It was overwhelmingly approved, and we began to develop the political organization necessary for carrying it out. We had a national convention in Chicago in Labor Day weekend, 1967, and it was attended by 5,000 delegates who represented every major progressive organization in the United States at that point, ranging from the liberal persuasion of the same nuclear policy group to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It was a wide swath of American progressives who gathered for the purpose of, we thought, of developing that third-party ticket. How naive we were. How naive we were. We didn't realize the extent and the power and the ability of the government to infiltrate and suborn a movement of that sort. And they did, using Richard Daley's connections with the Blackstone Rangers in Chicago. They created what was known as the Black Caucus. And every black delegate who came was harpooned into that caucus. When Martin delivered the keynote address, I was passed a note over my shoulder. And the note said, "Get him out of here after he finishes his speech, or we will kidnap him, hold him hostage, and embarrass him before the world." So I relate that message to Martin and, Andy Young, and Martin was spirited away. He was a unifier. There was no room for a unifier with a group that was determined to divide and to end that movement. So as we began without him in terms of resolutions on the floor on the convention, it became apparent what was going on, because resolutions were put forward that were designed to alienate whole segments of that, factions of that group, particularly anti-Semitic resolutions at the time. And that, of course, drove away much of the liberal money that was there to support that ticket. So they outflanked us, and in our naivete in those days, they beat us. So we then regrouped and thought, what next should happen? How else can we make this impact and end this war and return resources to the masses of Americans who had been deprived of social programs because of the funding of the war? And it was decided, with Martin's leadership, that there would be an encampment organized for Washington, D.C. Not a march, an encampment. We would have been called the Poor People's Gathering. And so we began to work on that. And that, in my view, is the ultimate reason that he was killed. Opposition to the war, one, and two, the fear of what would happen when 500,000 people would be assembled in Washington, camping in the shadow of the Washington Memorial for the purpose of visiting their legislators and trying to get them to reorient the budget of the United States and away from war into peace, freedom, and justice. Now, the Army knew much better than us that was a clear and present danger. 100 cities had burned that year in America. There was a revolution on the streets, a building on the streets of Paris. Henri Malraux was able to advise de Gaulle how to stop that revolution by co-opting the labor unions, co-opting the communists, and hanging the students out to dry. And that's what they did, and that's what made the French Revolution that was building go away. Well, Lyndon Johnson didn't have an Andre Malraux, and he thought of things in terms of force and power, and he thought that the way to subvert this potential revolutionary movement was with the use of troops. And he was advised, no, you don't have enough troops to do this. Westmoreland wanted 206,000 for Vietnam. They didn't have 206,000 for Westmoreland or Vietnam. And they didn't have 200,000 or so to put into Washington, D.C. to put down what would be a violent rebellion. Now, Martin, they knew, would never countenance violence in this kind of situation. But they believed that he would lose control of the movement and that the angry, radical forces who would attend this encampment would take over. And they would then lead a revolution in the nation's capital that could not be put down. So their option was to make sure that it became an insignificant gathering of Americans, of alienated Americans. And the only way to do that was to make sure that Martin King did not go from Memphis to Mississippi, which was the plan, and start the movement into Washington. He was never going to be allowed to leave Memphis, Tennessee. They had to get rid of him. And that, of course, is what they did. Now, at the time, I was driving into my parents' driveway in Yonkers, New York, the 4th of April, and heard about the assassination, and was obviously badly hurt and set back by it, but also frustrated. We came here for a memorial. Ben Spock and I and others came here for the memorial, then went to Atlanta for the funeral. And Bob Kennedy had made up his mind to run for the presidency at that point in time. I had handled Bobby's campaign as a very young man in Westchester County, New York, in 1964 when he ran for the Senate in New York. And Bobby asked me to come up and talk with him about the presidential campaign that he was about to undertake, and which I knew he was going to lead seriously. And I said to him, I've had it with politics, at least at this point in time. Bobby, thank you, but I'm through. And that's when I went off and started in the area of education for a period of time. Also believing that they had the right guy when they caught James Earl Ray. They caught him at the airport in London, as you probably know, and brought him back. He was inclined to desperately to get a trial, and he and Arthur Haynes and Judge Haynes and his father as his lawyers, and he was convinced to let Haynes go, who was determined to bring him to trial and to bring on Percy Foreman. And Percy was a well-known national criminal defense lawyer, convinced James that he would take it to trial, only to turn his back on that possibility as time went on, and finally convincing James that he wasn't going to ever get a trial because Percy ultimately said, my health is not good, and I'm not going to be able to give you your best defense. James said when he heard that, he knew that he was being set up and that he was never going to get that trial. But Percy then said to him, here's what I'll do for you, Jenks. I'll give you $500 to give it to your brother. You plead guilty. We get through with this. You plead guilty, cause no upset at the time of the hearing, And then you can hire another lawyer, use the $500 to hire a lawyer, and you can overturn that guilty plea and get yourself a trial. And that's what he did. And he put that in writing, and we, of course, eventually got a copy of that letter. But it was unfortunately too late and too little, and there was no chance that he was going to ever get the trial. Now, I later became aware of the position of the White House with respect to many of these things and many of these issues, and their growing interest in Bob Kennedy. I was invited into Look magazine. The managing editor and publisher Look magazine was a fellow called Bill Atwood. I don't know if any of you know her, remember Bill Atwood. And Bill asked me to come in, and he said he wanted to publish my Ramparts piece in Look, so the American people, through the mass media, not just a fringe magazine, but through mass media, would see what their dollars were buying in Vietnam. And this was very unusual and very exciting. Mike Wallace had similarly asked me to come sit down with him at one point, and he wanted to see if he could put me on 60 Minutes, but for the purpose of chastising me for being un-American for writing a piece that I wrote. I almost put him through a wall, a restaurant in New York called White, where he and 60 Minutes paid for the lunch. So much for Mike Wallace and 60 Minutes and there. But as I walked into Look, Bill Atwood approached me and put his hand out, shook my hand, and said, "Oh, you will be pleased to know that I had a visitor last week." Well, maybe not so pleased, but nevertheless, you're entitled to know I had a visitor last week. And I said, "Well, who would that be then?" And he said, "Averell Harriman flew in from Washington to see me. And he brought me a message from the President of the United States." I says, "And what was that message?" The message was the President sent his best regards and asked Harriman to tell me how much he appreciated my work with Look. But then he said he had a favor for me, and that favor was that I should never publish anything that Bill Pepper wrote to. So he looked at me and he said, how do you think? What do you think about that? You're not even 30 years old, and the President of the United States is worried that I might publish a piece that you wrote on Vietnam. And I said, I'm more interested in what you said to Governor Harriman. And he said, "Oh, well, I told him we were going to see you next week. And if we believed in what you were saying and your documentation, we were going to publish. Give the President my best regards." And away went Harriman. And this was a man whom we don't find in the media anymore. And we didn't find him very much back then, but we certainly didn't find him in the media today. In mainstream media, certainly not even in progressive media, open bought off by foundation grants and other inducements, so that they go so far and no further in their coverage of events. So that to me was very inspiring. Next week, however, Bill Atwood had Jim Garrison come up from the White House to talk to him about the Kennedy assassination, John Kennedy's assassination. I spent about 4 or 5 hours with him. I think Garrison must have spent 7, 8 hours with him. He was shaken badly by the Garrison meeting. He called Bobby at 1 o'clock in the morning. And he said to Bobby, "It's become very clear to me from what the district attorney of New Orleans has shown me and told me that the CIA organized the killing of your brother on behalf of the ruling forces of this republic." And Bobby said, "We know, but I've got to get the White House. Once I get the White House, I will reopen the entire case and the investigation of the assassination of John." That was at 1 a.m. At 4 a.m., Bill Atwood had a heart attack. And he left Look magazine in any series position he used to do roving articles occasionally, but he left as the managing editor. And his absence made sure that the articles that he talked about would never be published, and they weren't. And the deputy editor of Look, who was pushing for these interviews at this publication, was fired. New editor was brought in. So I don't hold any nefarious about the heart attack. Bill may well have even had a weak heart, and this may have been too much. As you know, he was close to the Kennedys, and so this may have been too much for him. Years later, after he died, I spoke to his widow, and she said, she thanked me for the call, and she said, Bill had a great deal of respect for your work and nice things like that, but please don't ever involve me at all in anything that you're doing on any of these cases. That I have to raise children in this country. So she was being very protective of her children, and I, to this day, have honored that respected that wish. All right, coming down then into the investigation of this case, for 9 years, I believe they had the right guy, that James O'Reilly was guilty. And I chose not to read evidence, chose not to get involved in any investigation. Abernathy called me at one point. We spoke. He said, I'd like you to go to the prison with me and interrogate James O'Reilly. I said, you go around the bend, Ralph? Now all of a sudden, 9 years later, you think that this man might have been innocent of the crime? And he said, I don't know, but I'd like to go, and I'd like to have you there to interrogate him. I said, it's going to take me quite a long while to prepare because I knew nothing about the case. So months later, actually, in August of 1978, imagine that, August of 1978, we went up to the prison, and I interrogated James under great stress for him for 5 hours. I brought a body language specialist whose job was to sit from the room and just watch Ray every moment as I put him under continual stress. We came away from that meeting for a whole variety of reasons, having confronted a very different person whom we thought we were going to meet, with a view that he was not the shooter. We didn't know what role he might have played, but we knew from that interview, that he was not the shooter. Reverend Lawson, many of you may know here in Memphis, Jim Lawson, who actually brought Martin into Memphis by the sanitation workers' strike, was in the room. Abernathy was there. Myself, a body language specialist. James's lawyer at the time was Mark Lane. He was there. And I had a free go at James. We believed he was not the shooter. It was unanimous. We didn't know what role he might have played. But he raised enough questions and enough issues that had not appeared in any of the reports that troubled me. So I began then to come to Memphis for the first time. I began to look at the scene of the crime, wonder why the whole brush area behind the rooming house across the street had been cut down to the ground and cleared away the very next day. Wondered about things like that. Would go back to James with the questions, kept going back and forth and visiting him, and he asked me then to represent him. I refused. And it took 10 years, from 78 to 88, before I would agree to become James O'Reilly's lawyer. Mark abandoned the case from, I guess, about 82 or so. And then I took it on. And from 1988 to 1998, when James O'Reilly died in prison, we tried to get him a trial. We went through the system all the way up to the Supreme Court, tried to get an evidentiary hearing, tried to get a trial, and we failed. At one point in 1991, 92, we were very frustrated, and we came up with the idea that we should try a mock trial. We could bring a jury pool from across the country, people from across the country into a jury pool, select a jury, have a judge, a reputable, it was a retired federal judge, Marvin Frankel, be the judge in the case, and Hickman Ewing, who was a local prosecutor, a U.S. attorney, could be the prosecutor, and I would work as defense counsel with a local lawyer who was a criminal defense specialist. April Ferguson was her name then. I think April has remarried, and I don't know if April is here, but anyway, she would be co-counsel. We would try this mock trial. We tried it in 1992, 93. We tried it for 10 days. It took the jury 7.5 hours to find James O'Reilly not guilty. Now, that, of course, was never covered. Thames Television of London and HBO, with the money, sponsored the trial at that point. And it was a shocker that any jury hearing evidence, which was relatively simple evidence, frankly, would find this man innocent. But it opened the doors, and more people came forward with evidence and information that we had no idea about before. So that resulted in the first of these 3 books I talked about, called Orders to Kill. And that Orders to Kill was published in 1995. And it laid out the evidence that we had up to that point in time. And after that book came out, more witnesses came forward, and more information was developed. And the case started to take on a whole new perspective. And we tried again to go through the system, but we couldn't. We were failed. But we increasingly were getting to the bottom of the fact that this man was a patsy. He had been set up as a patsy. I had come to believe that by 1988, but now the evidence was much more strongly indicative. And a number of very good local people came forward and helped us. Some of them may be in this room. I see Nate Whitlock is here in this room, and Nate Whitlock's mother, Levada Addison, had a little shop or a coffee shop or where a mafia man named Frank Liberto used to stop occasionally for coffee on his way home. And around the time of the hearings, the House Select Committee hearings, they were on television. Liberto was there one day, and it came on the television, and he just blurted out to Nathan's mother words to the effect that I killed that, I had that nigger killed, words to that effect. And shocked her, upset her. And when Nate heard about it, he confronted Liberto, and it was not a very happy situation for Nathan that day onward because of that type of confrontation. But people started to come forward with information we never had before. Now, the King family approached me sometime after 95. I guess it would have been around 96 697, and they asked me to come meet with them, and I did. And I opened all my files to them and all the evidence that we had. And this was following a phone call from Isaac Farris, who was Martin King's nephew. And they then decided, without any hesitation at all, that James O'Reilly was innocent and that everything should be done to try to get him a trial, because that was the way that would get closure and they would get to the truth of the case. James died in 1998. I suggested, and they agreed, that we bring a lawsuit against a man called Lloyd Jowers, whom we had trapped in lies. And Jowers was one of the 3 people out in the brush area at the time of the shooting. And he was the one who took the gun from the shooter and brought it back into the kitchen of his grill, which was Jim's grill, and broke it down. But he didn't plan on having his girlfriend, Betty Spates, there. And Betty saw him coming in light as a ghost, out of breath, brushing past her, breaking the gun down, and then saying to her, "Betty, you wouldn't do anything to hurt me, would you?" Well, she said, "No, of course not. Oh, yeah, of course not." He took the gun, he brought it out of the kitchen of the grill and put it on a shelf at the grill. So we had Jowers very seriously implicated. Betty would not tell this story to anyone for a very long period of time. And finally, I got it from her at one point, and we decided we had enough. We had enough to either indict Jowers or to sue him. I had a local lawyer who worked with me on the case for years, Wayne Chastain. Some of you may know Wayne. I have enormous respect for Wayne. He sat outside the grand jury room for 2 weeks trying to get in to put this case before the grand jury. And they wouldn't let him in. So we eventually decided on a civil trial. Now, the civil trial is covered in the second book called An Act of State. And it goes through the lawsuit against Jowers and other agents of government of the United States, state of Tennessee, city of Memphis. That trial in 1999 went on for 30 days, and there were 70 witnesses. And without a doubt, they laid forth the history of the assassination of Martin Luther King that we knew up to that point in 1999. That was covered in, that book came out in 2003, in the Act of State. So it opened up. It opened up volumes of new people who had evidence that they wanted to relate before they died. That's often what happens in a case like this. If you write a book, and you take 3 or 4 years to write a book on a case like this, you don't have the relationships, you don't have the historical perspective. And unfortunately, unfortunately in some ways, unfortunately in others, in terms of my first family, I got involved in a slippery slope where I just couldn't let it go as more and more evidence came out. I had to move the first family to England because my 4-year-old son, Sean, was picking up telephone hearing threats on his father's life. And the stress of that whole investigation was imposing itself terminally on that family. So I moved from Hull to England. There's no way you can raise little kids in an atmosphere like that. And then I commuted. I had to commute. And I commuted back and forth to the United States, and particularly to this city of Memphis, and spent quite a bit of time in Memphis developing relationships with people who had information you had never revealed. Never revealed. It meant visiting a number of the bars. It meant befriending many police officers who were good and decent people, who were very upset that at the highest level of the police force in the city, that of the police director itself, Frank Holloman, they were being betrayed. So there were many, many policemen who were very helpful, and I developed personal relationships with many of them that lasted until they died. And they tried to do the right thing as much as they could. Okay, so after all of that, evidence came forward that there was a man who had critical information about who the shooter was. And we deposed him, long deposition, and filmed him. He worked as a janitor at the rifle range, police department rifle range. And he observed, amongst the racist comments that would come from various members of the force who were out there, he observed a particular individual who made him very concerned. This man was a bit of racist and hated King, was a soldier in Vietnam, lost his brother in Vietnam, and was reportedly the best shot on the Memphis police force. And one day a gun was brought in to him, and it was shown to Lenny Curtis, who was the janitor who worked there and became the witness. And Lenny was told this is a very special rifle. The day of the killing, this officer practiced with that rifle all day until he left the rifle range around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was practicing and working with that rifle all day, April 4. Lenny had the unquestioned feeling that this was no good and this guy was up to no good, and saw him when he left that day with the rifle. Tried to notify a local pastor, was unable to get the pastor, who at that point had been down visiting with Dr. King, I believe. This was very frustrating. But then there was the shooting, and he knew what had happened. He knew what he had been observing was his worst fear. Well, I guess we met up with Lenny and then interviewed him in around 2011 or so, 2010, 2011, and took his deposition and filmed him. But I couldn't use it. I couldn't draw upon it at all whilst he was alive, because I was sure they would kill him. A couple of things made us very uneasy. He was under surveillance at his home. An unmarked car was outside his home all the time. He was going in one day, opened the door, started to light a cigarette, and smelled gasoline. Someone had turned on the gas in his kitchen. He saw a V constructed outside his kitchen window, like this, with the centerpiece focusing directly on the window. So he knew that they were on to him, because he would just, where he worked and what he heard, he was obviously someone that they should be concerned about, or a shooter should be concerned about. So then one day he was invited to ride with this officer into the main police headquarters allegedly to pick up some checks, for salary checks. And as they rode, the officer took a detour, went through a wooded area, and then showed his gun. And said to Lenny, what do you think about the killing of that nigger King? What do you think about that? You think they got the right guy? And Lenny said immediately, oh yes, of course they got the right guy. He was being very defensive. course, they got the right guy. I believe that. That's good, Lenny. Let's hope you don't ever change that opinion. So he was always in their sights, in a sense, because he was in a very vulnerable position. Well, when Lenny died, that then made it impossible for us to have that deposition, which would be available for use. So we're talking about 2013 as a court date. Then another man came forward who had been the son of the leader of the Dixie Mafia, most powerful Dixie Mafia group in this whole area, the Atkins family. Russell Atkins had developed an on-the-ground relationship with J. Edgar Hoover and the Bureau over many years. And he was used for a variety of tasks by Hoover over that period of the relationship. And he was the man whom Hoover decided would be the person on the ground who would work with Frank Holloman, who was chief of police and fire. Holloman had been in Hoover's employ, worked in his office for a number of years. So they were a good combination. So Atkins and Hoover went about the business of planning this assassination, but Hoover was never directly involved, because what he would do would be to send Clyde Tolson, his number two, into Memphis with instructions and money. And what we learned from a 2-day deposition of this son of Russell Atkins, who died the year before the assassination, and his next in line son, Russell Jr., took over working with Holloman. He was able to carry on the work of his father, if you will. But the man who came forward, now well into middle age, beyond middle age, told us something that we suspected but never could prove, that they arranged for James Earl Ray to escape from prison. And Hoover sent in, through Tolson, $25,000 that this boy, Ron Tyler Atkins, took with him when they went to the prison to see Warden Swinson. He and his father drove, and the money was in the car, and it was given to Swinson to organize James Earl Ray's escape. That was around November, December 64. James' escape was arranged in April 65, as I recall. So James's escape was organized. He had been profiled. Hoover had made a request to the commissioner in Missouri to give him the name of a convict who would be docile, would be pleased to be out, who would be not a rat, but they could use in such a circumstance. So James's escape was arranged. James then was picked up and handled by a man called Raoul. People scoff. Always James talked about a Raoul. Who is this? Well, Raoul is a man named Raoul Coelho, Portuguese immigrant to the United States, Portuguese intelligence, came to the United States around 1961, and very dangerous man. But his job was not to be the shooter. His job was to control James Earl Ray and move him around the country so that he would be available for the assassination's patsy. And that's what Coelho did. When I learned about Coelho, he, of all places, was living in Yonkers, New York. And I put him under surveillance for days. He was the only person out of about 200 who James Earl Ray ever identified from a photograph as being the man who handled him. And when one of our investigators knocked on the door with his photograph and showed it to his daughter in Yonkers, she said, "Wow, anybody could get that photograph of my father." anybody to get that photograph. She identified, confirmed that he was benign. So James was being wet nursed and he was being controlled. He was kept in Los Angeles for a long period of time. And I couldn't understand why they kept him in Los Angeles. Dumb me. Before the facts of it. Why they kept him there for so long. I learned that the Army had a Special Forces unit. It was revealed by Stephen Tompkins when he was writing for the Commercial Appeal, and I saw Steve. And I pleaded with him, and he agreed that he would talk to two of the members of that Special Forces unit that were here in Memphis on April 4th. They were here as backups. They didn't know that. They had 2 snipers and 2 spotters in specific places. One team was on top of the main railroad building, would you believe? Other water tower. And they were to shoot on orders. Both Andy Young and Mark Mahim. Andy was very surprised to hear that he was the target, but Tompkins conducted these interviews. I had to pay the expenses for them, and he didn't know any much about the case, so I gave him the questions. These two guys had fled to Mexico because they thought there was a cleanup going on, and they just left the country. To this day, they're in Mexico, hiding out. So Steve would ask them questions to get information from them, and we learned they were briefed at 4:30 in the morning. They were shown photographs of King and Young, and then they headed up toward Memphis. And they took up the positions where they were assigned by their contacts in the Memphis Police Department. And they were there, ready to do killing. They didn't know that there was a civilian who was really the first choice in terms of the killing, but they just knew that they were there at the right time and they were supposed to do killing. That's all. Now, the civilian, of course, is the police officer, whom I mentioned, who fired the one shot that hit Martin King in the head. And that immediately gave us all some pause, because if it was a military operation, they're taught to shoot center mass, never in the head. So that was a question that we had about that. And that bullet that hit Martin King in the head and brought him down on the balcony was fired by the civilian shooter, who earlier that afternoon, after he apparently had left the rifle range, called Frank Liberto on the phone. And we know that because John McFerrin, who owns a gas station and a small shop up in Somerville, Tennessee, Johnny used to go into Memphis on Thursday to Liberto's sort of wholesale warehouse where he would buy food for his grocery. And on that day, he heard Liberto on the telephone, answer the telephone, and scream into the phone, "Shoot the son of a bitch when he comes on the balcony, and then go to New Orleans and collect your money, and don't call me again." The McFerrin has always stood by that story, and that brings the pieces a bit together in terms of that particular shooting. Now, it gets worse. It gets much worse. What I tried to do in the final book is to now put the full context of all of the critical depositions we took in the appendix to the book. So nobody can say, Pepper's making this up, he took this out of context, or whatever. They're all there. You're welcome to read for yourself the lengthy depositions of critical witnesses with respect to the facts that I'm telling you now. But it does get much worse, as far as I'm concerned. The doctor, the Atkins family doctor, was the head of surgery at St. Joseph's Hospital. His name is Dr. Greenblatt. Greenblatt was visiting with Russell Atkins Jr. some weeks before the shooting. Present at that meeting was Ron Tyler, actor, who we deposed and who was there. He was involved as an observer with so many of these things as a young man and teenage boy. It's staggering. He was taken to his first lynching when he was about 8 years old by his father. Father was a member of the Klan and was grooming the youngest son for similar temperament and similar activity and lies. He was sitting there when Dr. Bland said to the father, if the bullet doesn't kill him, make sure they take him to St. Joseph's Hospital, where he was the chief surgeon, and we will make sure that he never leaves the hospital alive. And that's one statement on the rope that he made. And everything I say to you, you have to think about, read, and form your own opinions. And that's what you have to do. Another witness came forward sometime afterward. He's a diabetic, and he's blind. And he's the son of Lula Mae Shelby, who was a surgical nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital. And after the killing, she was kept in the hospital with the rest of the staff and let go the next morning. And when she got home, she gathered her family around her, and she told them what she observed and what had happened. And she started off by saying, according to Jonathan, her son came forward, she had died. She started off by saying, I don't know why they had to kill him. She said, Dr. Bland came into the emergency room with 2 men in suits, and he was alive. Martin King was still breathing. He was alive. Now, the bullet wound might have been sufficient to eventually kill him anyway, but he was alive on the gurney, on the emergency room gurney, which, oh, by the way, I had just seen for the first time earlier this afternoon. It's here in the collectibles room. He was on that gurney, and he was alive. Bland said to everybody, stop working on that nigger and let him die. And then he said, after a pause, all right, all of you get out of here. He cleaned them all out of the room. And as she was going out of the room, she heard this sound. Caught her attention. She was the last one, and she was at the door. She turned around and looked over her shoulder, and she saw the 3 men spit on the body of Dr. King, who lay there. Then she saw Dr. Bland take a pillow and put it over the face of Martin Luther King and suffocate him to death. And I believe that is how Martin Luther King ultimately died. Not from a bullet wound, although the wound might have killed him, but from the suffocation of the pillow on his face. So that is part of this man's story as he told it under oath. He was very moving, and everyone in the room who heard it, my court reporter and others speak of that, no reason to doubt this at all. What? No reason to doubt, and no reason to doubt much of the other evidence that we took under oath. So that investigation all those years led to this culminating fact, in my view. They were not going to let him go from Memphis. They had everything set up to kill him in Memphis. He was not going to be allowed to lead a major movement in Washington that could have become a revolutionary activity. He was going to be stopped. He was going to be stopped right here in Memphis, Tennessee. And they had the wherewithal to do it. For a long time, they kept James L. Ray in Los Angeles. They kept the snipers, the military group in Los Angeles as well. None of them could understand why all of a sudden they were moved into the South, into New Orleans, Birmingham, and Memphis. The locale had changed. And it bothered us for quite a while. And then we put two and two together and realized that Bob Kennedy was going to be hit in Los Angeles after the California primary. And it would not be seemly to have two assassinations 2 months apart like that. So they had to move the King assassination to this city, to Memphis, Tennessee. And of course they did. Bobby was hit, also assassinated. His presidential effort was finished and ended at that point in time. And this is the nature of the beast that lives quietly amongst us. When Hoover sent Tolson in on a regular basis to meet with Adkins, and they took 2 transatlantic trips, Russell Adkins and Clyde Tolson. Ron Clyde was told to call Clyde Tolson Uncle Clyde. I have in the book photographed Tolson with members of the Adkins family. They had a very close working relationship. This particular operation. I've not been an assassination buff. I have my own thinking about the John Kennedy assassination, but I've not really done a great deal of work on it. I was quite close to Lyndon Johnson's mistress, Madeline Brown. Madeline gave Lyndon his only son. Some of you may know some of this history. And when they held a meeting on the 21st of November at Clint Murchison's house in Dallas, attended by Nixon, Hoover, the oil men, mayor of Dallas. John McCoy was there. This major mystery man played such a role helping Nazis escape to South America after the Second World War, became chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. I couldn't understand it. Why was McCoy at that meeting with the rest of this crowd the night before the assassination? Then I realized I had known the Rockefeller family and members of the Rockefeller family for a number of years. Knew Governor Rockefeller quite well. I won't go into a lot of those details. But, and his daughter, Annie, and David's daughter, Abby, who's still a friend of mine. So but I won't go into those peripheral details. But it was clear to me and puzzled me why the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank would have been at that meeting. To me, it meant that David Rockefeller, the Northeastern liberal ruler, signed off on the assassination of Jack Kennedy, along with his racist oil banker clients. Took me a long time to put that together. I asked Abby, David's daughter, to set up a meeting for me with her father before he died. And she said, "Why do you want to meet with Dad, Bill?" And I told her. And she said, "Bill, he's trying to reconcile with the family, 104 years old. If I set that meeting up, he'll see you, but that'll spoil everything that he's trying to do with us in his closing days." I said, "Forget about it. I don't think he's going to say anything worthwhile anyway, so just stop worth it, forget about it. But we live in a very complicated world, and it's very easy to condemn some people as being unsavory and evil people, and other people to be saintly and good. And the older I get, the more I realize that we live in a world of gray human beings. There are people who do a lot of good, but also have another side to them. There's someone like a Bill Moyers who knows what Johnson was about. Knows, but will never go there. And yet does a lot of interesting work in terms of the people. Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! Amy will never have me on her program, but she'll sit in a corner wherever I'm being interviewed. So, because she won't lose her Ford Foundation grant, I'll be in the know. And there's a progressive people who do some very good work. We have to acknowledge that. But there's another side to them. Another side. The head of the 902nd Military Intelligence Group at the time of the assassination was a man called John Downey. He was a colonel. He was CIA and also military colonel. And he was Johnson's briefer on Vietnam. Give this an example. He would come in every 2 weeks, 30 days, and brief the president on the war, what was happening, and the disaster he saw it. And he said, "Why are we there, Mr. President? We're losing blood and treasure. For what and for whom? Why are we there?" And he kept asking this. Johnny never had one meeting without asking this. Johnson never answered it. Finally, one day, Johnson pounded the table. And he said, "John, I can't get out of Vietnam. My friends are making too much money." That's really what it's all about, isn't it? John Downey went home that afternoon and told his wife, "Pack your bags. I'm having myself assigned to Ottawa, to the Canadian Embassy. I'm not going to participate in this any longer. This is a tragedy." And he went up and he got out. He got himself out of it. But he was called back the following year in June 1967 to head the 902nd, most secretive military intelligence group. And it was John Downey that picked the military team, the Alpha team, the sniper team. And it was John Downey who put 2 photographers on the roof of their fire station here who photographed the assassination and everything going on there, including the shooter. Photographed. And John Downey who received those photographs. So he was very much involved in the assassination of Martin King and had no compunction about it whatsoever. Had no hesitation whatsoever about being involved in it. When I put my foot in the door of his daughter's home in Staten Island, she first said, "Dr. Evans, I really don't want to talk to you." I said, "Please just give me a half hour of your time to discuss your father." Because I think he was probably a very good man. And somebody had contacted me using his name and set us on a wild goose chase. And we had him in Bermuda, and he was just there for this information. So I said, "I'd like to tell you about that." So she said, "Okay." I went in, sat down. I had another lawyer with me. Cuba sat down. She told me the story about her father. She said he was so furious about what was going on and what the president had told him. But he had no compunction about Martin King because he grew up in a racist society and in a racist environment. He didn't see the need for the actions that Dr. King was taking, and he believed that Dr. King was going to lead the nation into revolution. So we had no compunction about participating in the assassination. So there you have a bond. One, on the one hand, can be morally outraged by what his government is doing, and on the other hand, can become involved in something that he's saying that as a chorus is a moral outrage that he would do it. But you have to look at these things. When Lyndon Johnson came into Clint Murchison's house on the 21st of November at 10 o'clock at night, they all went into Clint's study. They were there for about 20 minutes, Madeline, because Madeline was there at the party. They were all there for about 20 minutes. When they came out, Johnson came up behind her, put his arms around her, and said, after tomorrow, the son of a bitch and Kennedys will never embarrass me again. The next morning, he called her from Fort Worth, when they were coming in. He said, I'm going to go hear the son of a bitch deliver his last speech. So there's Lyndon Johnson being used by the ruling forces and being the successor to John F. Kennedy. Now, that's an anecdote related to that assassination. And there are many others about that one, about Malcolm, what happened to Malcolm, and how Malcolm was killed. I know the family, but I have not gotten involved in that one. And in terms of Sirhan, we have lost in every court in this country, through the Supreme Court. All we want for the first one was to have an evidentiary hearing. And we've not had an evidentiary hearing. The evidence is so powerful, so strong. Sirhan was never closer to Bob Kennedy than I am to that gentleman in front of me, 5 feet, 6 feet. Bob was hit with 4 bullets that were powder burn range. That meant the gun was pressed against his back. Yeah. By a shot mob, they'll down behind it and shot on an upward direction. And Sirhan had been mind-controlled, programmed for 2 weeks at a clinic that we've identified to be the patsy. When he got the cue to stand up, pull a gun, and see a target that he had just seen at the firing range, and shoot at the target, fires 2 bullets at the target. Then his arm was pinned to the table, and his bullets went wildly around the room. I was hit with 4 shots. There were a total of 13 bullets fired. So there's no question that they don't read the briefs. They don't want to read the briefs. They don't want the truth. And frankly, most people, in my experience, don't want to know the truth because they really can't handle it. They feel hokey, perhaps, if they know it. What can they do? But at least the fact that you have it is something in and of itself. So I want to thank you for putting up with this narrative, and I hope it's been useful to you. This museum is carrying on very important, noble work, and I hope you continue to support it and all of its efforts. And be safe, be well, and think critically of everything that you're being taught everywhere you go by mass media and even progressive media today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless. Thank you. Excellent. Memphis.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to collect the questions. We have time for just a few. I promise we're going to review them, but not anything personal.
Spaceship. Boy, the one.
All those urinals. I read that Actor State. This is the updated version of all previous books.
Yeah, right.
No, but it's worth a read. And it's a big, but you'll like it. Yeah.
And we interviewed at some lawyers.
A lot of heavy stuff here. Oh, yeah, we know that. Well, we can't even deal with it, though. He talking about that stuff, but locally, we can't deal with it. Man.
You from Memphis? You from? Thank you. Oh, you up there? I did. You seen the girl didn't I? Oh, you said the power set.
It ought to be like an emotional thing.
Honest question. Do you have any evidence or thoughts about local Memphis leaders involved in Dr. King's assassination besides Memphis Police Chief Frank Holland?
Excellent question.
Read it again.
I heard the question. Yes, at the time, as it emerged later on, I believe there were a number of more senior Memphis police officers who knew about the assassination and the plan to kill Dr. King. I cannot believe that your local police chief also did not know about that, but I don't have hard, documented, sworn testimony with respect to other participants in the assassination.
Next question, Dr. Pepper. What do you think of Jim Garrison's case against Clay Shaw in 1969?
Well, I probably coming from the same place, knowledge that many you are. I've read the history of the case. I think Garrison's whole operation was infiltrated by the government, and I think there was a lot of disinformation that went on. I think some critical witnesses were killed. From what I understand, the case against Clay Shaw was a strong case, and it should have gone forward. I know Oliver Stone has done this famous movie on JFK, and he opened it up to some extent. But I think because of fictionalization of some parts of the case, it loses the clout that it might have had.
Cornelia Crenshaw was also with Katie Sexton when she was admitted to St. Joseph's on the night of Dr. King's assassination. She feared that she would never come out alive. She did not.
When who are we talking about?
Cornelia Crenshaw, local Memphis leader.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that particular death.
You brought up the word naive. Was President Kennedy, Dr. King, and Senator Robert Kennedy and their inner circles party at fault for the involvement of their assassination?
Were they at fault?
Were the inner circles of President Kennedy, Dr. King, and RFK having some complicity in their murder?
Yes, there were involved in each of the organization of those three assassins. There were traitors. There were people who betrayed them. And that's par for the course. We have difficulty in carrying out an operation like that without traitors. I have to tell you one thing I left out. Some of you probably know Martin King was supposed to be here in room 202 at the Lorraine Hotel. His room was moved to 306, which made him heavily exposed. That removal was organized at the request of the Attn group, by a member on Dr. King's staff. So that is an example of John Kennedy's movement. His route was changed in Dallas, and his route was changed by a traitor who was responsible for the.
That was my question. My subclass, those who were not traitors, were they so naive not to?
I can't put too much on the naive say a lot of other people, but I suspect that any reasonable person around that should have worried about the actions of those individuals and didn't. And in the invaders had 2 rooms here at the Lorraine at the same time that Martin King did. And the invaders were thrown off the property about 15 minutes before the assassination. They were ordered off the premises for the assassination. Hotel staff person knocked on the door and said, "You have to go now, because SCLC has decided they're not going to pay your hotel bill anymore." I said, "Well, wait a minute, we've been working with Dr. King on a peaceful march. Everything's going fine. What are you talking about?" And the day it was going for 6 o'clock. So the bill is in already. What are you talking about? "You have to leave now. Those are my instructions." Who gave you those instructions? Well, the person who was controlling the money, Reverend Jackson.
Thank you so much for your bravery. There has not been much talk or concern about the movements of Fire and Police Chief Frank Holloman. Why not?
Well, Holloman was a long-standing FBI agent, special agent in charge, very close to Hoover. I think he has not been placed as directly in the frame of this assassination as I have been able to do with this final book, Upon to Kill King, and the observations of the Atkins, Ron Tyler Atkins, the son of Russell Atkins.
Talk a little bit about the connection between Carlos Marcello and Frank Liberto.
Frank Liberto was a mafia lieutenant, barely low-down mafia lieutenant, who was assigned to Gina Casey, who was the godfather here in Memphis. The Casey was very close to Marcello, and Liberto, as a result, was also quite close to Carlos Marcello. Ron Tyler Atkins remembers Marcello visiting with his father, and that they were all working as a group together. Marcello being somewhat distant because he was in New Orleans.
How does Bear Tyler family fit in the overall scheme of things?
The Tyler Atkins family were a racist Dixie mafia. That's a second-level mafia operation that made money in a variety of influence peddling and illegal ways, and often involved murder. They had at least 2 hitmen as a part of the family. You may recall that on the night of the killing, one of the shooters, not the shooter, but the spotter, was seen coming down over the wall and running up Mulberry Street, getting into a waiting police car and being taken away. That spotter was Captain Earl Clark. That it's important to understand that they were all together on this. They were all intermingled, and they all bore the responsibility.
Is it true, in your opinion, that the real shot came from the bushes below and not from the second-floor window of the Young and Morrow building?
Yeah, there's no question that the shot was fired from the brush area. There's no question about it. People like Jim Orange saw the smoke rising from the bushes. Earl Caldwell, an Air Times reporter, saw the people in the bushes. A taxi driver saw Clark coming down over the wall following the shot. He phoned it into his base, and he said he assumed that the police were on the job because he saw the man that came down running into a police car. That taxi driver named Buddy was killed that night. He was killed by a member of one of the hitmen of the Atkins family. Took him out.
Final question. Can you explain how Dr. King was on the balcony at the moment for the clear shot?
Well, he he was going to dinner at Billy Kyle's house, brother and Billy Kyle's house. And he was coming out to go to that dinner, that barbecue dinner at Kyle's house. Kyle's made up a story for, 25, 30 years that he was in the room with Dr. King for a half hour before he was killed. In actual fact, a little before 6, Kyle's went up to the room 306 door and knocked on it. The door opened slightly and then closed. Kyle's then walked down the balcony about 70, 80 feet north of the balcony and just waited. Dr. King came out around 6 o'clock or so, and Abernathy was behind him. As King got to the door, Abernathy said, "Oh, I forgot to put on my aftershave." And he went back into the room to get the aftershave and put it on. Martin went out and was just waiting, standing on the balcony, just waiting for Ralph to come out, which Ralph did after the shot.
Briefly, one more question. Did you talk about the unusual circumstances of Dr. King staying at the Lorraine Motel, and the history of his activism in the city of Memphis?
He had never before stayed overnight at the Lorraine Motel. Never. One of my concerns about Ralph Abernathy is because Ralph had said at one point, this was the King Abernathy room. This is where we always stayed. I never stayed there overnight. What happened is Martin would go to the Lorraine occasionally in an afternoon or during the days to meet with local people because they were more comfortable at this facility, more comfortable. So he would go there for that purpose. But he never stayed at the Lorraine. He decided to stay at the Lorraine this time because he was trying to really overcome a disastrous march that had taken place previously, and he wanted to show that he was there with the people, and he decided to stay at the motel for the one time, the last time. He often stayed at the Rivermont Harley Inn Hotel, where they had every room had a microphone in, and they had a transmitter up on the roof. I know this because of a very good Memphis police investigator, Jim Smith, who was assigned to that detail.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Cook,
We're
you
gonna
remember me, John Billings, sir?
excuse me, sir. In
You
just
remember John Billings?
Yes, John. how
Yes,
are
sir.
you?
May I speak now? I want to say, I do respect your dedication and perseverance, as we know each other quite well, to finding out the true killer of Martin Luther King. But I'd like to ask you a question, sir. Did you totally research the St. Joseph Hospital?
Excuse me, sir. I
Did
don't
you
mean to
research
be
the
very
St.
rude, but we
I was
have,
at the St. Joseph Hospital.
we respect your opinion, but there are plenty of other people in here who have asked, who've been very patient.
This is all on Google. John Billings Private Investigation. Google it, sir.
Sir, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Mr. Pepper will be able to sign books afterwards. We thank all of you for coming. Please fill out your survey.
Why didn't you ask me about it? You forgot I was there, Dr. Becker.
Please.
It's full of crap. What you said is full of crap. I'm coming. If y'all want to believe that, I was there. He's going on hearsay. Google John Billings Private Investigator.
I will.
Find out for your own. Find out for your own self. Why don't we have a little, I'll take a lie detector test, Dr. Becker. Will your hearsay witness that?
Wow.
Well, good night with everybody.
Passion, boy.
We appreciate everybody's passion. We appreciate the spirit of dialogue.
Right.